hard-nosed football player, and Weeb Ewbank never seemed to like him. Ewbank and him had sort of a love-hate relationship. When he was finally stepped away from football, it was because he had had some injuries, and Ewbank felt that there wasn't a place for him on the team anymore. But I know at the time, from the research again, Amici was really offended by the whole situation. But he was the leading ball carrier for the Colts in the playoff game, or in the championship game, I should say, and gained a lot of key yards in that in the two drives that are well known as the one I already alluded to, and then obviously once the game went into overtime, the Giants had first shot at it. They got the ball, couldn't move it, and the Colts moved over and went 80 yards with Amici getting the final yard for the touchdown. But Amici was just a fantastic player and a fantastic fullback. Again, of a I don't know who you would compare him to, of a modern day player, maybe somebody like a Jerome Bettis, or even a couple years back like a Larry Zonka. But he was just a hard plowing fullback.
Talking to George Bozeka, the author of the 1958 Baltimore Colts, Profiles of the NFL's First Sudden Death Champions. So can you lay out for us the career of Raymond Berry, who's an incredibly nice guy, if I may say so myself?
Oh, he is. He's a fantastic guy. I would definitely agree with you with that.
Shula's nice also.
Who's that?
Don Shula's nice also.
I'm not surprised.
But who's a jerk? Bob Greasy.
Really?
Bob Greasy is one of the biggest jerks you'll ever meet. I was like 5 or 6 years old, and I was in a Jet shirt. It was my first ever sports card show, and Bob Greasy was picking on me so much. I was like so furious. I hate Bob Greasy to this day.
That's interesting. No, Ray Berry is just a class act. And he was one of the most, cerebral wide receivers I think of all time. He worked so hard at the game, and I think that was why, after his career was over, he became, obviously a successful head coach with the Patriots, took them to a Super Bowl. Unfortunately, he came up against that, fantastic, Bears team with, McMahon and the 46 defense, and, Ditka as a head coach, and Buddy Ryan, who was the architect of that defense, and, probably one of the greatest single-season NFL teams of all time. But, he was, a fine coach with them, and the players respected him, too. I'll go back on his playing career, but one of the stories was that when he came to the Patriots, the Patriots automatically knew that they had something special because he was just night and day from the previous coach when he took over. But he's originally from Texas. His father was a football coach. He played in Texas. Came on with the Colts, and as I said, he had a reputation on the team as, being all about football and all about getting better. When other guys would maybe go out and carouse, like, some of the, more famous carouses on the team, like Artie Donovan, the famous defensive lineman who later became even probably more famous after his football career because of all the appearances he made on Letterman. He said, those guys would be out, partying. Ray Berry would be there looking at film, working on his game, trying to figure out ways to beat the other team. He would basically put down things after he would look at film and everything on a notepad, and then he would talk to Unitas and say, I can get open on these plays. And that's how they would work during the week. So, he was just amazing that way. I think famous Los Angeles Times reporter, and I hope I get the quote right, said that, he could get open in a busy subway station. That's the kind of player he was. He was very precise in his routes, and he retired as a leading receiver in NFL history at that time. Obviously since then Jerry Rice has taken over on that, but I can't say enough about Unitas and Berry. They were just one of the great quarterback receiver tandems of all time. Lenny Moore?
Yeah.
Okay. Lenny Moore from Reading, Pennsylvania, excelled at every level. He played at high school, played at Penn State. This was pre-Joe Paterno. Played at Penn State, and then also played, obviously, with the Colts. he was a running back flanker, so he was he was very much of that time. The other players that I compare him to during that era were like Frank Gifford, Paul Hornung, guys that could run with the ball, catch the ball, and do they were basically threats in a number of different ways, and he was that kind of a player. If you look at his statistics, you'll see that his statistics, like he's not like in the top 20 as a rusher or probably as a receiver, but if you look at the total numbers and the number of touchdowns that he scored, it's just amazing. He was a playmaker, and he was a game maker. He's that kind of player, and for all intents and purposes too, he's a great guy. I know my son's a local sportscaster here in the Northeast Ohio area, and he's had the opportunity to talk to Lenny at the Hall of Fame when he comes in every year, because he comes into the Hall of Fame festival every single year since he's a member. And he said when he interviews Lenny, he said Lenny will talk to you for forever, and his memory is just unbelievable about things that Unitas did, things that he did, and everything else. So he's just a great guy too. He was that multi-threat running back. I can't think of a person like in today's game, because I feel that there's so many specialists anymore, but he could do it all.
Talking to George Bozeka, the author of the 1958 Baltimore Colts, Profiles of the NFL's First Sudden Death Champions. So can you lay out for us the career of Jim Parker?
Yeah, I'm so glad you asked, because he's somebody I really wanted to talk about. Jim Parker was the foundation of the Colts offensive line back then. He was known as Unitas' bodyguard, and he was just an amazing offensive lineman. He played. He actually came from. He played some high school ball in Toledo, but he would always sort of downgrade his ability as a high school player. But he was recommended to Woody Hayes when Woody Hayes was at Ohio State. Now you're talking 1950s Woody Hayes, and he was during the early years of Woody's career at Ohio State. And he went to Ohio State. He was impressed with Woody, and he won the Outland Trophy at Ohio State. He credited Woody Hayes with a lot in terms of teaching him technique and how to be a football player and all those things. And he, just as Woody had nothing but fantastic things to say about Jim Parker, Jim Parker also had fantastic things to say about Woody Hayes and playing for him. He said that if Woody Hayes would have told him to go move the stadium 2 inches to the right or 4 inches forward, he would have gone out and done it. That's how much he believed in Woody Hayes. He ended up obviously with the Colts. As I said, he was the foundation of that offensive line. For years and years, he was the one of the best offensive linemen in football. I think after football, he owned his own liquor store in the Baltimore area. I think one of the more poignant stories that I read is that when he heard that Unitas had passed away, he said he drove out in the country, he pulled off the side of the road, he wept because he said it was the first time I wasn't there to protect him. So that's how much Unitas meant to him, and Parker meant that much also to him. It was interesting because obviously Ohio State with Woody did nothing but run the ball. If they passed the ball, it was very, very little, 3 yards in a cloud of dust. So he said he didn't know all that much about pass blocking, but he learned real quickly, once he got into, training camp, because, back then, veterans on the other teams would make rookies just look foolish. And he said that, the first time he came up against Duck Atkins, who played for the Bears, he said, he was just, made to look stupid. And it was the same thing in practice. But the great thing that he said about the other, linemen is that, back then, he said the players really worked hard to help each other improve. They coached each other and they coached up each other to get better because they knew it was for the good of the team. So, he said that was the experience. And he was also, one of the common threads in his team was how cerebral they were. Maybe they got that from Eubank, because he would, study to get better, look at film and all that. So he was also into that, much like Ray Berry and the other players. So they were very much into that.
So what can you tell us about Baltimore's defensive line in the 58 season?
They had, just a fantastic defensive line. I think that's a common thread when you have a championship team. But they had Art Donovan, who I've already talked to, who obviously maybe became just as famous after football as he was during, because he wrote his book, and then he was sort of the Bob Uecker of football, appearing on talk shows up until his death. I think Letterman made him just about as famous as anybody after his career. Also had Gino Marchetti, who ended up in the Hall of Fame. Donovan's in the Hall of Fame. Also, one of the lesser-known members, but he was a very good Don Joyce. And then also the fourth member was Big Daddy Lipscomb, Gene Lipscomb. Lipscomb, really an interesting story. Died in the early 60s of a heroin overdose under, again, mysterious circumstances. But he was a huge guy, and good offensive or good defensive lineman. Played for the Rams originally, and then came to the Colts and really blossomed under Weeb Ewbank. And he was the other member of that great defensive line that they had. The Colts let go of him. He ended up with the Steelers, and it was during his time with the Steelers that his life came to such a tragic end. He was a really interesting person. He was sort of a lot of contradictions. They said that he had not the happiest of childhoods. He grew up in a very bad ghetto area in Detroit, and he carried that with him the rest of his life. Players said that he almost like he had nightmares at night. He was always not a very good sleeper. They would hear him, crying, and hear him, with nightmares and stuff like that. So that seemed to carry him through his whole life. He never went to college. He actually was found by Pete Rozelle, who was then with the Rams. This was before he became commissioner, and he saw him at Camp Pendleton because he was in the Armed Forces, and he was playing on their team, and he found him and suggested him to the Rams. Really didn't do well with the Rams. They thought he was just, too raw and really, just didn't have it. But like I said, he blossomed with the Colts and Ewbank because Ewbanks loved him, and went on. Actually, probably had his best year in 1962, and in May of '63 he was dead. So it's a sad story. But he was a very solid lineman for them. I think if his career had continued, he might have also got some, Hall of Fame, consideration.
Talking to George Bozeka, the author of the 1958 Baltimore Colts, Profiles of the NFL's First Sudden Death Champions. And George, Eric Fischetti would kill me if I didn't ask you this, so I'll get you out on this. Would you be able to describe to us the greatest game ever played?
Sure. It's interesting that you say it because that's how it's known. Everybody calls it the greatest game ever played. But the one thing I saw what some of the players said is that they didn't. A couple of the players didn't necessarily think, like Art Donovan in his book said, that he didn't necessarily consider it the greatest game ever played. I think it has devolved into that. I think that what he said, it was probably one of the most significant games ever played. Because it basically created the marriage between pro football and television, because you had this dramatic game going into sudden death overtime. First time that a championship game or a regular season game or a playoff game had gone into sudden death. They'd experimented with sudden death prior to that in a preseason game, but this was the first sudden death game. Actually, the players didn't even know what was going to happen when the game ended up tied. They said, "What do we do now?" And then somebody said, "We're going to keep playing." It was obviously played at Yankee Stadium. It was on television. One of the more interesting things is toward the end of the game, somebody tripped over a cable and they had dead air for about 2 minutes. So they had a guy, the television people had a guy run around on the field to sort of distract things until they could get the cable back up because they were worried that the game would end and they wouldn't be able to show the key play of who won the game. So, it was a different time, obviously not as sophisticated as we are now with televised games, but I think what the players say is the reason that it has that place is if you look at the game, you had so many Hall of Famers that played in the game for both the Giants and the Colts. You had all the drama of the Colts being ahead, then the Giants going ahead, the Colts having the great drive to tie the game, and then the great drive in overtime to win the game. You had Unitas and Barry playing such great games. And there was a contrast between the teams.